Hey the internet, this is Lock. I've been thinking about large-scale endgame content and where it's going. Raiding has been a staple of the MMO endgame since before many current raiders could read the names of the bosses. When we think about endgame, this is often where our minds go. Early on it was an activity that put them massively in MMO, but I think that this is changing. Guild Wars 2 and ESO use instance large-scale PvP as their main form of large-scale organised multiplayer content. I know there's world bosses too, but if you're trying to compare them to raiding, your argument's built on pretty shaky foundations in my opinion. The end game of Arcade is all about large-scale PvP if you're doing it right, and the Guild vs Guild Warfare in Terra is the only large-scale content available there. Even in WildStar, a game designed to bring back old-school raiding, one of the more original ideas was a riff on large-scale siege warfare. Upcoming games like Camelot Unchained and Crowfall are building their entire games around large-scale open warfare. And while Camelot Unchained was successfully kickstarted, Crowfall has a lot of buzz in anticipation of its Kickstarter campaign. Pantheon had a failed Kickstarter campaign in its bid to bring back the more old school content. So, it seems clear the MMO winds are blowing in the direction of PvP for large-scale content, and I mean, the reasons for this are fairly obvious. It's quicker and cheaper to produce content that will last longer. With improvements to technology, players can have an advantage of skill rather than stats. And that goes hand in hand with designers no longer having to rely on strict aggro mechanics for player abilities or encounters. You know, if you add to that the fact competitive multiplayer is so ubiquitous in the games industry as a whole, it's often shoehorned into games where it has no place at all, let alone games that are really built to take advantage of it, as modern MMOs are. And I think it's the truth that players are much less impressed by the scale of raiding than we used to be. You know, the console version of Battlefield 4 has 64 players to a map. Can we still call a 25-man raid massively multiplayer? Can we? I know raids used to be bigger. That's weird as well. Raids used to be bigger, and now they're smaller. I know massively multiplayer. Sure, a lot of that was about the shared open world, but again, the trend in MMOs is less and less about the player interaction in the open world, more and more about these instance encounters. I'm just talking about the trend as well. I'm not trying to suggest any kind of content in an MMO is inherently better, is inherently any more worthy than another type of content. You know, it's just a trend towards devs offering a PvP game type as a solution to providing large-scale content rather than raiding. I'm sure you've noticed this trend as well. Now, if you ask me, I think with all of this focus on PvP as large-scale endgame, I imagine we can expect to see something of a vacuum in the next few years with an underserved raiding community who are looking for fresh challenges and not being able to find any in the newer games that are available to them. It really got me wondering about what a niche property raiding game would look like, how a raiding scene could work within a more limited scope. Going back to Camelot Unchained, you know, they want to create the tri-realm combat. That's what they want to do. They want to create an open world PvP game, and they're laser focused. Everything to do with their development is focused on making that aspect of the game and nothing else. So what would a game that was focused on raiding in the same way look like? In my opinion, I think the main challenge would be exactly the same challenge as it's always been with raiding, being able to build content at a rate that matches how quickly players knock down that content, how quickly players can just blow through it. In my opinion, this has never been achieved, and it can't be with methods that are currently being used. So the obvious plan is to throw out the old model that doesn't work and find a system that can accomplish this. And in today's world of crowdfunding, social media campaigns, niche properties don't have to convince a publisher it's a good idea. They can convince us, the players, instead. And if I'm right, there'll be players waiting to be convinced. So if we carry on down this road, the obvious question is procedural raid generation possible? Is that something that can be achieved? Can bosses and encounters be woven together from a pool of possible options? Does it matter as much if a boss is a little over or under-tuned? Does it matter if a boss isn't quite as interesting as it could be if new bosses are appearing in multiples every couple of weeks? Whole encounters are appearing in multiples much more regularly than we see in current games, where it can take months and months and months for a new raid to open, for it to just be blown through in a matter of days. If they could make a procedural system where after a raid gets blown through in a matter of days, then a new raid can be spun up, tested on a public test server, and then allowed out for public consumption. You know, is that possible? Let me know in the comments below, please do. Another challenge would be creating a satisfying progression system. You know, the gear treadmill has worked really well in the past. People get hooked on that treadmill, but again, I think that's not something that can be sustained if you have a much more frequent and more regular update cycle. I just don't think that players could keep up with that kind of breakneck pace without just burning out. You know, if they've got to like chase all the time, chasing the carrot, you never have that time where there's just not really much to do other than hang out in the capital city. I think a lot of players would be put off very quickly by that. So I don't know, off the top of my head, as an idea, something like a resistance system could work. Something like Agony Resist from Guild Wars 2 Fractals. If the bosses earlier in an encounter, if those bosses were tuned to be easier, if they dropped maybe consumable resources that you could use to resist attacks of bosses that came later in the encounter, you know, that's a nice loop. Where you're still being rewarded for taking on that earlier content, and eventually if you save up enough of these resources, you'll have a much easier time with the later ones. But you know, it also allows groups that are highly skilled, very knowledgeable, and players that want to be on the tip of the progression, you know, they can take on the more difficult challenges quicker because they wouldn't need those resistances as much as the more casual players would. Or perhaps materials for crafting equipment that's tailor-made for the encounters in the instance, or a particular instance your guild's working on. You know, is it an instance with all fire bosses, all fire attacks, and you go, great, max out fire resistance, where jobs are good and let's go? Or would there be a mix in the instance of bosses with ice attacks who were, you know, weak to poison, but also fire bosses in there as well? You know, then you need to adjust and think, okay, what equipment are we going to take? I've gone on about that for too long. I get caught up in design ideas, but you see what I mean. There are alternatives to a purely power-based progression system. You know, you're not just making your stamina and your attack power go up. There are decisions to be made. There are things that you can collect to create a worthwhile system of rewards, but it isn't, at the same time, it isn't an ultimate absolute. Now, again, things like making sure everyone knows who's downing these bosses first, how fast they're doing it, with how many players, you know, creating a sense of rivalry, creating a sense of competition. I honestly don't know why more games haven't done this, why they haven't focused on it, you know, creating league tables and leaderboards within the game for certain bosses, even if it was just, you know, a DPS race, like a time it took to kill a certain boss on a certain date. I don't know why games don't make a bigger deal out of it. You know, you can create a nice a nice competitive community with that. And competitive raiding, you know, it's an anticipated regular feature at BlizzCon now. Notable raiders broadcasting their success, sharing guides. It's a huge source of free advertising. And, you know, YouTube and Twitch are things that didn't exist when the raiding game was first being established. And now it's something that a company could really take advantage of if they wanted to do that. And for me, one more question for a game like this. Imagine a very small, focused, niche raiding title. I think one big question that for me personally I've never been able to really develop a firm opinion on is whether an open world setting would be necessary to go along with it. You know, would we need an enormous world that was full of quests, leveling content, leveling dungeons, battlegrounds, arenas, that kind of thing? Would we need all of that extra stuff in a game that was focused on raiding in that way? I honestly think it would be a massive waste to create all of that if you wanted to focus on raiding content. If you had a couple of zones, you know, with procedural mobs roaming around that you could practice your skills, farm a few materials for a decent set of starter equipment, you know, so you have a typical but much shorter, maybe a more sandbox idea of progression that almost acted as a tutorial and maybe a space that you could go to try out certain different things. You know, what else do you need? A city. You need a big city full of mailboxes to dance on. What else do you need after you have that? On the other hand, why I can never quite pin down why I think this or not is, while it seems wasteful, or at least it's very resource heavy. It takes a lot of resources to create those kinds of experiences. The last I heard, you know, in World of Warcraft, they spend $1 million per zone just for that. So you can imagine, extrapolate that over the whole game. Remember, they redid most of it during the Cataclysm expansion. You know, is it necessary to create a game environment that allows a raiding scene to thrive? You know, do you need that slog of a leveling process to really establish the raiding scene? We've never, you know, I've never seen it done. I've never seen the two things separated, and I don't think I'll ever decide whether it's possible enough until someone tries it, until I actually see it. Obviously, again, it does cut out the group who play MMOs for a kind of open world adventure. The old school people who, to them, massively multiplayer means, you know, you're out in an open world with all these other people running around as well, just experiencing the adventure together, not in an instance goal-driven scenario. But in my opinion, that's a group who will be served by upcoming games, will be served by games who focus on this large-scale PvP endgame content. You know, they have a place in those, whereas I think there's a gap. There's something of a gap for people who are into hardcore raiding. That's what they enjoy. That's what they want out of these games, and it seems a shame to let those players slip through the cracks. So please do let me know what you think. Would you be interested in a stripped down raiding game like this? Is there a game coming up that you think serves the raiding scene? Do you think raiding's completely dead? Do you think it's over? Do you think it's the type of game people just don't want anymore? Or maybe you just want to leave a comment telling us why you hate PvP for some reason. I know it's going to happen because I mentioned it. Someone will. Let us know in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. If you thought this was a worthwhile discussion, if you thought anything in it was interesting, why not click like? It's nice, isn't it? It's nice hitting that like button. It's something good that you can do that doesn't cost you anything. And for more of the same, do hit subscribe. And thank you very much for watching. Bye!